had a website reach out to me saying like, hey, we have a bit of a problem. We're using JavaScript to lazy load stuff, and is lazy loading a problem? And this is why my job is not always very easy, because like people come to you and say like, hey, we have a JavaScript website. Is that a problem? And you say, no, JavaScript sites in general are not a problem. And they're like, okay, but is lazy loading with JavaScript working? And then I think a little bit about it, and I'm like, yeah, that works. I mean, lazy loading is perfectly fine. You can do it natively, or you can use JavaScript. That's not an issue. And I can show you that it's not an issue by actually going to one of our websites, one of the websites that I built to kind of just like show that it works. And I need to actually go to a different website than I tried to go to avgp github.io/lazy loading experiments, because I went and checked a bunch of libraries to see how lazy loading works with Googlebot. Here we have a website. You can see on the scroll bar that as I am going down, more content is being loaded. And basically, in the initial version of the HTML, if I go to view source and we look at what the HTML originally has, then we are seeing, if the internet plays along, we see what the server originally sends. It sends an image that has a one-by-one placeholder, and then has some data source, which is what the library uses to lazily load this once it comes into viewport. So like, none of these is a source at this point. It's only the one-by-one image, and the other ones, the 500, 400, 300, 200, 100, are lazy loaded with JavaScript. So if I take this website and I plug that into the, if I plug that into the mobile-friendly test, which lives here conveniently, then we would potentially see if it actually loads all these images. And I'll show you an important tip here, because I do see a lot of people are looking at the wrong thing in the test. They're like, how would I know if it loads these images or not? I can only see the above the fold. Yes, but for one, you can actually go into the HTML view and you can see what the HTML looked like. So here we see lazy loading has replaced the 100 by 100 into the source. And it did that for all the images. If I scroll all the way down to the 500 by 500 image, which is down here, you see it has also loaded that one. You can also click on View Details and on Resources, and then you can say like Show All Resources. And here we see it loaded 100 by 100, 200 by 200, 300 by 300, 400 by 400, 500 by 500. So clearly, JavaScript works and lazy loading with JavaScript works, right? And this was just one library and one example, and we've seen that this has worked. But for some reason, it doesn't seem to work on this news website. And now let's have a look at how this news website looks like. So we see from the scroll bar on the side, it has like a little bit of scrolling for me to do here. So we have like a bunch of stories, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories on my screen. I scroll down, and then it continuously keeps loading more stories. Okay, interesting. So I do the same thing again that I did beforehand. I'm like, okay, so let's see what we are getting here. What is happening in the browser behind the scenes? Because that gives me a good idea of what's happening in the real world. So I reload the page so that I get a fresh version of it. And it looks like this is apparently where all the content lives. I can right-click and say, like, I want to inspect this element. And then it shows me the element. And I can see, okay, so this is basically a list of news items in this unordered list. And then the last one is grand jury subpoena for signal user data. Grand jury something, something. Okay, let's scroll. Here, grand jury down here. And then it seems to block for a moment. And then we have more stories. And now actually you see like more stories are being loaded. So some JavaScript does some amount of lazy loading here to actually get the content in as we scroll. That's interesting. So let's actually have a look at the network as well. And we reload one more time. And we pull this up a little bit so that we get a little more look-see. So what happens here is it loads top stories, which is a JSON file that contains what? Let's have a look. Okay, so like lots of numbers, but not like any content. So it needs to do something else to load content. And it's quite interesting. You see here 269 something something 493. And that's a JSON file that it loads afterwards. And it seems to be loading them. That's 1100,395. So it loads that. So basically, it takes the top stories, which are these IDs apparently, and then loads files with these IDs for the individual stories. So let's go to the last one that it loaded. Okay. Look at that. Grand jury subpoena for signal user data. That seems to be the last story that was in the initial HTML. So this seems to be a batch of 10 that have been loaded. We can also see it here like that. That has been all the files that have been loaded. And now if I scroll down, what happens? More files are being loaded. So this is the file. Hold on, where have we been? I think this is the one. Yeah, this is the one that we have seen beforehand. And now there's like more stories coming in. Egyptologists. Let's see. Grand jury, the botanist who defied Stalin. So like, yeah, there's a bunch of stories being loaded that way. Now, let's actually get a publicly available URL for this one as well, so that we can actually try and see this in Search Console. Here we go. So we do see some content. We can check the HTML. And I have a suspicion. That we're going to see the grand jury story as the last story on this website. And it's exactly that. So the initial batch that gets loaded when the page loads actually happens. It shows up here, but it doesn't seem to be showing up here. So let's see, like it loads 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then it stops loading anything else. The only thing that is loaded elsewhere is like the top stories JSON itself, and then it just loads the 10 files. But it doesn't actually do anything. And now I wonder, is that because the lazy loading was implemented incorrectly? So let's have a look. The nice thing is that I can reload the page real quick and basically look at the last file that was downloaded here, which is the 66554. And then I can try to see what happens if I scroll. So more files are being loaded. So for instance, down here, this seems to be one that has been loaded. And the nice thing is that I can now click on Initiator. Initiator shows me the code that triggered this, because this didn't trigger itself. If I were to just click on the top stories, for instance, Initiator is in this index file somewhere. And then I can click on it, and then I see, so the JavaScript fetches this file. Fantastic. Now I want to know who triggered like this batch of additional stories. And I'm already seeing a problem, because it looks like what triggers this is a window.onOverscroll. So window.onOverscroll triggers when you scroll to the very bottom of a page, and then it runs code that you want to run. So we can check that out. And what it does is window.onOverscroll increases some variable and then calls a function called showPage. We could also just jump in here, and showPage takes the IDs that we fetched and takes a slice out of that list of IDs and takes the next 10 IDs and then fetches them. And then it basically, once it comes back, it is being entered into the document. So this lazy loading is incorrectly implemented because it relies on scroll events. You should not really do that. Googlebot does not scroll. So if your lazy loading depends entirely on scrolling, that's a bad thing. How can you implement lazy loading properly? Well, if it's for images, you can definitely use the native lazy loading. If it is for something else, you can use the intersection observer API, which is built into the browser. And that one actually does not rely on scrolling. It also works on things like resizing and stuff. And that works well with Googlebot and other bots too. So in this case, that exhibit B is not just because JavaScript has been used, it has been used incorrectly. So you need to test your implementations, because if the developer would have done what I have done and just plugged it into this tool, they would have seen like, oh yeah, no, the scroll events are not firing, so the content doesn't show up. You can fix that. It's not impossible to fix it. So you should probably want to fix that as well.